The moment Anna Rhodes saw the river swollen with spring flood water, brown and churning and angry as a wounded bull, she understood with cold certainty that she might not make it to the other side alive, and neither might her 8-month-old son. She had left Abilene, Kansas on the 14th of April in the year 1873 with a covered wagon, a mule named Bessie, $17 sewn into the hem of her skirt, and a grief so heavy it had taken up permanent residence somewhere between her ribs. Her husband, Tom Rhodes, had been dead for 4 months. A fever had taken him fast, the way fevers did on the frontier, leaving no time for goodbyes and no money for anything resembling comfort. He had left her with a land deed to a parcel in the Oklahoma Territory, a son named William who was too young to understand any of it, and a promise she had made herself standing at his grave in the frozen January earth that she would not let all of it come to nothing. The deed was her only hope. The land was hers if she could get to it, file the proper papers in the territorial office in Guthrie, and work it long enough to make something of it. Her brother-in-law back in Abilene had told her plainly that she was a fool, that a widow with an infant had no business attempting a solo journey of more than 200 miles across open territory. He had offered to buy the deed from her for $40 and a train ticket back to Ohio, where her mother still lived in a narrow house that smelled of boiled vegetables and disappointment. Anna had folded the deed carefully into the same oilskin pouch as William's birth record, tucked it against her heart, and left before dawn. She had been on the road for 11 days when she reached the Canadian River crossing. The river was supposed to be fordable at the Rocky Shallows 3 miles east of the town of Kingfisher. According to the hand-drawn map, a livery man in Caldwell had pressed into her palm along with a look of frank concern. It was fordable in a dry spring. This had not been a dry spring. The winter snowpack had come down from the mountains all at once, and the Canadian was running wide and furious, and at least 4 feet deep at the crossing, maybe more. Anna sat on the buckboard of her wagon with William in a sling tied across her chest, one hand gripping the reins of her mule, and she stared at the river with the kind of expression a woman wears when she is calculating the difference between a risk and a certainty of disaster. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw the rider. He came from the northwest, following the riverbank at an easy canter on a pale gray horse that moved with the fluid confidence of an animal that had been well trained and never mistreated. The rider sat straight in the saddle, not with the rigid posture of a man trying to impress anyone, but with the natural ease of someone who had spent so many hours on horseback that riding had become an extension of thinking. He wore a brown canvas duster that was travel-stained and practical, a dark hat with a low crown, and the kind of boots that had been resoled at least twice. There was a bedroll tied behind his saddle, a rifle in the scabbard, and a coil of rope hanging from the horn, and none of it looked decorative. He pulled up his horse a respectful distance from her wagon and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not feel the need to fill silence unnecessarily. He looked at the river, then at her, and then at the river again. "You thinking about crossing?" "I am across," Anna said, which was not quite accurate, but she was not in the habit of revealing doubt to strangers. He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, more the suggestion of one at the very corner of his mouth. "River is running about 3.5 feet at the shallowest point. Your wagon wheels will touch bottom, but you will be moving against a strong current. That mule does not look particularly enthusiastic." Bessie, as if to confirm this assessment, had planted all 4 hooves in the mud and adopted an expression of complete and unshakable stubbornness. "The mule will cooperate," Anna said. "She might," he agreed. He looked at the baby in the sling, and something changed in his expression. It was not pity exactly, but it was a kind of serious attention. "That your little one. His name is William." The man dismounted. He did it the way he did everything else apparently, without drama or announcement. He dropped his reins over a willow branch, walked to the edge of the water, and waded into his knees in his boots without any visible hesitation or complaint about the cold. He walked 30 feet out, reading the bottom with his feet, then came back. "There is a gravel bar about 40 feet in," he said. "After that there is a channel that runs about 4 feet deep for another 20. The far bank is firm. If you angle upstream a little on the way in, the current will help correct your line." Anna looked at him steadily. "Who are you?" "Clarence Hartwell," he said. He did not offer a handshake because his hands were dripping river water, but he nodded with enough gravity that it served the same purpose. "I am heading to Guthrie to file a grazing claim. I crossed this river last fall and I know it reasonable well." "Anna Rhodes," she said. "I am also heading to Guthrie." A beat of silence passed between them in which a great deal of unspoken information was exchanged, in the way that two people on a lonely stretch of frontier territory exchange information when they realize they are both going to the same place, and there is safety in numbers and also a considerable amount of reason to be careful about who you trust. "Your husband?" Clarence asked, not intrusively but practically, the way a man asked a question he needed the answer to in order to know how to help properly. "Dead," Anna said. She said it the way she had learned to say it, flatly and without softening it, because softening it only invited a kind of sympathy she did not currently have the capacity to receive without falling apart, and she could not afford to fall apart on the north bank of the Canadian River with a mule and a baby and the far side to reach. Clarence took that in without flinching. He looked at William again, who had woken from his nap and was staring at this new face with the wide-eyed openness that babies have before the world teaches them to be guarded. "I can carry the boy across on foot," Clarence said. "Keep him above the water level while you manage the reins. The mule will have an easier time of it if she is not smelling a frightened infant, and you will have both hands free." Anna felt something move through her chest at those words. Not gratitude exactly, not yet, but a recognition of something. She had been managing everything alone for 4 months. The managing had become a kind of armor, layer after layer of competent self-sufficiency that kept the grief and the fear from having room to breathe. Someone offering to carry William across a river was not a grand gesture, but it cracked something open just slightly, because it was practical and kind and asked for nothing in return that she could identify. And those were the 3 things she had wanted most and had least access to since January. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because it is the sensible thing to do," he said, as if the question surprised him slightly. "And because I have 2 hands and dry footing would serve the boy better than wet footing." She watched him for a moment longer. He held her gaze without apology or aggression. His eyes were dark brown, patient and direct, the kind of eyes that said, "I will tell you the truth whether it is convenient or not." "All right," Anna said. She unwrapped William from the sling carefully. The baby made a noise of mild protest at being disturbed, looked at Clarence with that same open, evaluating stare, and then, with the complete and inexplicable trust that infants sometimes bestow on strangers, allowed himself to be lifted without crying. Clarence held the child against his chest with one arm, settling William against his duster with a kind of practiced sureness that surprised her. "Have you held a baby before?" she asked. "I have 4 younger siblings," he said. "I have held many babies." He waded into the river without another word. Anna gathered the reins, clicked her tongue at Bessie, and the mule, released from the weight of the sling and perhaps sensing the resolve around her, lurched forward into the water with a grunt of displeasure that turned into a steady plodding effort as the cold river came up around her legs. The current hit the wagon broadside the moment they entered the deep channel, pushing with a physical force that made the whole rig shudder. Anna leaned into the reins, keeping Bessie angled upstream the way Clarence had told her. She could feel the water pulling at the wheel spokes, feel the wagon bed shift and rock, and her knuckles were white on the leather. She watched Clarence. He was 20 feet ahead of her, moving steadily through water that rose to his chest in the deep channel, one arm raised to keep William above the surface. The baby was held against his shoulder, small head tucked near the man's neck, and Clarence was moving through the roiling current without panic, without hurry, planting each foot deliberately on the gravel bottom before committing his weight. His hat was soaked and the water was pulling at his duster, and the cold had to be extraordinary, but his arm holding William never wavered. She watched him and felt the crack widen. She did not have the language for it yet. She was still too close to grief, still too armored, still too busy gripping the reins of a panicking mule in a flooded river to have language for anything. But she felt it, the way you feel a change in the weather before you see it, the way the air shifts before the rain. Bessie made the far bank with a heaving lunge that nearly unseated Anna, and the wagon wheels caught gravel and then solid ground, and the whole terrible crossing was over in less than 4 minutes. Clarence was waiting on the bank. He was drenched from the chest down, river water running off his duster in sheets, and his boots were making sounds that had no dignity to them at all. But he was holding William out toward her with that same steadiness, the baby still dry above the collar line, and there was something on his face that she would think about for a long time afterward. Not triumph, nothing so self-congratulatory as that. Something quieter. Anna took her son. She pressed her face briefly against William's warm head, breathed him in, and got herself back together. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," Clarence said. He retrieved his horse from where the animal had followed them along the bank with a calm that suggested the gray gelding had seen far stranger things. He mounted without asking for help and looked down at her from the saddle. "There is a town about 8 miles southeast," he said. "Kingfisher. They have a livery, a general store, and a boarding house that takes women travelers. The road is firm from here." "I know where Kingfisher is," she said. Then, because she was being ungracious when she had no reason to be, she added, "But thank you for telling me." He nodded. He looked at her for a moment, then at William, and then back at her, and whatever he was thinking he kept to himself. "I will ride ahead and make sure the road is clear," he said. "There have been reports of claim jumpers moving through this area this spring. It would not hurt to have someone scout the first few miles." She wanted to tell him she did not need an escort. She had been telling herself and everyone else that she did not need an escort for 11 days. She looked at his face, looked at the pragmatic steadiness of him, and thought about claim jumpers and a baby and $17. "If it suits your way," she said carefully. It did, apparently, suit his way. He turned his horse and rode ahead at a walk, not so far ahead that she felt abandoned, not so close that she felt smothered. She snapped the reins, and Bessie, exhausted and indignant from the river, moved at the fastest pace she had managed in 3 days. They made Kingfisher before sundown. The town was small and raw, the way frontier towns were in 1873, buildings of fresh-cut lumber that still smelled of pine sap, a main street of rutted mud, a blacksmith whose hammer rang out steadily in the early evening air, a saloon from which piano music drifted on the breeze. The boarding house was run by a woman named Clara Finch, who was approximately 60 years old, shaped like a stovepipe, and who looked Anna up and down with the assessing gaze of a woman who had seen every variety of frontier trouble and sorted them into manageable categories. "Widow," Clara said. It was not a question. "Yes," Anna said. "Baby is healthy. Very. Room is 2 bits a night. Supper is included. The cowboy can stable his horse at Jensen's on the south end." She said this last part while looking at Clarence in a way that communicated clearly that she had no objection to him as a person, but that the boundaries of her establishment were well established and not negotiable. "Yes, ma'am," Clarence said, and rode off toward the south end without argument. Anna put William down on the bed in the small room that smelled of cedar and lye soap, and watched her son wave his fists at the ceiling with an energy that suggested the river crossing had affected him not at all. She sat down next to him and put her hand flat on the quilt and breathed. She was still alive. William was still alive. They were closer to Guthrie than they had been this morning. She thought about a man holding her baby above floodwater with one arm, steady as a fence post in a windstorm, and she pressed her lips together and told herself that was enough to think about that. Supper at Clara Finch's boarding house was salt pork and boiled potatoes and cornbread, served at a long table with 3 other travelers. Clarence was at the table when she came down with William propped against her hip. He had changed into dry clothes and his dark hair was still damp at the temples. He stood up when she entered the room, which was such an instinctive and unperforming gesture that she almost missed it. He had saved her a seat. She sat down. Clara set a plate in front of her and fussed briefly over William, with the kind of suppressed tenderness that people who claim to be entirely practical sometimes carry in spite of themselves. "Boy needs feeding," Clara said, and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a small bowl of softened cornbread soaked in milk that William attacked with great enthusiasm. The other travelers were a land surveyor from Wichita named Holt who talked too much, and a Mennonite family, the Brenners, a husband and wife and their teenage daughter, who spoke mostly to each other in quiet German and ate with methodical gratitude. The conversation at the table was the normal conversation of the frontier road, weather, road conditions, rumors of land prices, the reliability of various territorial officials. Clarence spoke when spoken to and not otherwise. He ate steadily and without fuss, refilled his water glass once and twice passed the bread basket to Anna before she had finished deciding whether she wanted more. It was not attention-seeking, it was simply attention. "You filed for your claim yet?" the surveyor Holt asked Clarence. "That is why I am going to Guthrie," Clarence said. "Grazing land, river-bottom land along the Cimarron, good grass, good water. I have been scouting it for 2 seasons. A lot of competition this spring," Holt said. "Lot of Eastern money coming in, trying to tie up parcels before the smaller operators get there." Clarence looked at him with an expression that was not worried exactly, but alert. "I am aware," he said. "You," Holt said to Anna with the cheerful intrusiveness of a man who confused friendliness with courtesy. "I have a deed already," she said. "I just need to file the certificate of occupancy and establish residence." "All by yourself?" "That is the plan," she said. Holt looked at William, then at her, then at Clarence, and made the obvious social calculation so visibly that it was almost embarrassing. Clarence gave no sign of noticing. He was looking at his plate. "The Cimarron land," Anna said, turning to Clarence, because she needed to say something or Holt would continue. "Is that near the parcel boundaries east of the river fork?" Clarence looked up. Something shifted in his expression, a genuine interest that had nothing to do with politeness. "Where is your parcel?" She described the boundaries as she knew them from the deed. He listened carefully, and she watched him doing a mental map, the way a man who knows a piece of country does when he is placing new information into existing knowledge. "That is about 12 miles south of my land," he said. "Good soil there. There was a family tried to work it 2 years ago, but they went back east after one winter." "I am not going back east," Anna said. He looked at her, that simple, clear look. "No," he said, as if confirming something he had already assessed. "I do not imagine you would." After supper, she nursed William in her room and laid him down to sleep in the middle of the bed, surrounded on both sides by rolled blankets so he could not roll off. She sat in the straight chair by the window and looked out at the Kingfisher Main Street in the purple dusk, at the warm lamplight in the saloon windows and the silhouette of the blacksmith shop and the ink-dark shape of the distant tree line along the river. She thought about Tom. She thought about the early days, when he had been full of plans and she had been full of belief in his plans, when the Oklahoma Territory had seemed like the obvious answer to everything that the small towns of Ohio could never provide. Tom had been a man of tremendous enthusiasm and moderate follow-through, and she had loved him for both even when the second quality required considerable patience. He had died believing they would make something of the land, and she intended to make sure he had not been wrong. She also thought, briefly, and with something she refused to examine too closely, about a pair of brown eyes and a steady arm in a flooded river. She went to sleep. In the morning she was loading the wagon before 7 o'clock. The sun was already warm, carrying the particular golden clarity of an Oklahoma spring morning that made everything look both beautiful and possible. Bessie was fresh and cooperative in the way that mules sometimes were after a day of rest, as if the stubbornness needed to recharge overnight. Clarence was at the stable at the same time, saddling his gray. They did not plan it. There was no negotiation or discussion, no invitation offered and accepted. They simply both headed out of Kingfisher on the same road at the same time and fell naturally into the same pace, his horse walking alongside her wagon with the unhurried companionability of two people who have decided, without saying so, that they do not object to each other's company. "How far is it to Guthrie?" she asked. "About 60 miles from here. 3 days of decent travel if the roads stay firm. And if they do not, then longer," he said simply. She almost smiled at that. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that is only comfortable between people who do not feel the need to paper over everything with noise. William, in his sling, was watching the landscape pass with the intense curiosity of an infant who finds the entire world equally fascinating. He made a grab for Clarence's horse when the gray got close enough to the wagon, and Clarence, without missing a beat, guided the horse close enough that the baby could touch the animal's warm neck. "He likes horses," Clarence observed. "He likes everything," Anna said. "He has not yet learned to be selective." "That might be wisdom," Clarence said, but his voice was dry enough that she could not quite tell if he was being sincere. "Or it might be inexperience," she said. He glanced at her, that almost smile again. "Both things can be true," he said. The road wound south and east through rolling grassland that was just beginning to come into its spring color, the pale gold of the dormant grass giving way to new green. The sky, a wide blue that went on far enough to make a person feel both very small and very free. Meadowlarks called from fence posts that appeared occasionally, and then vanished as if the idea of enclosure had simply not yet caught up with the land. Around mid-morning, they stopped at a shallow creek to water the animals and let William have his feeding. Clarence dismounted and watered his horse downstream, giving her privacy with a consideration that was so matter-of-fact it did not draw attention to itself. He crouched at the water's edge and refilled his canteen, and said nothing until she spoke. "You have been out here long?" she asked. 7 years, he said. "Came out from Tennessee in '66. After the war, she understood. Many men had come west after the war for reasons that varied and were often not discussed. He was 30, she thought, or close to it from the weathering and the steadiness of him. She was 26. "What did you do before you started working toward the grazing claim?" "Cattle drives," he said. 2 seasons up to Abilene on the Kishom Trail. Before that, worked several ranches in Texas. Before that, things I would rather not recount at a creek on a spring morning. The war." She said, not intrusively but directly, the way he had asked about her husband. "The war," he confirmed. She did not push. He did not expand. They both seemed to understand that some territories had fences and that was simply how things were. "Tennessee," she said. "Which side?" It was a direct question and she knew it, and she asked it because she needed to know who she was traveling with, and she was not a woman who got the answers she needed by being indirect. He looked at her with those patient dark eyes. "The side that lost," he said. "I am not proud of everything about that, but I would not lie about it to make it easier." She took that in. It was 1873, and the war had been over for 8 years, and the frontier had a quality of erasure about it that the older states did not have, a sense that what mattered was what you could do now, and not only what you had done before. She was not a woman who believed in holding accounts open forever when a man showed himself clearly in the present. "All right," she said. He looked at her for a moment as if he were not sure whether she was dismissing it or accepting it. "All right," he said back quietly. They made 12 miles that first day out of Kingfisher and camped at a bend in the road where a stand of cottonwood trees offered shade and windbreak. Clarence built the fire and she cooked, dividing the labor without discussion, each of them moving around the campsite with a natural efficiency that would have suggested practice if they had known each other more than a day. She made salt pork and dried beans and coffee, and he ate without any of the performative appreciation. she had sometimes encountered from men who wanted something, that elaborate praise of simple food that was really about other things. He just ate and said quietly that it was good, which it was, and helped her hang the food bag in the cottonwood against predators. William, tucked in his basket in the wagon bed surrounded by quilts, slept with the deep authority of a child who has decided the world is fundamentally trustworthy. "How did your husband come to have the land deed?" Clarence asked. They were sitting at the fire with their coffee, the flames low and orange in the cooling dark, the stars coming out overhead with the intensity they only achieved far from any town. "He bought it from a man in Abilene who had gotten it in a poker game," she said. "Which tells you something about the man and perhaps something about Tom. Did it tell you something at the time?" "I thought it was romantic," she said. "I was 23. Land in the territory seemed like the beginning of everything." "What does it seem like now?" She looked at the fire. "The thing I owe him," she said, "and the thing I owe William, and possibly the thing I owe myself, though I have not had much practice with that last category." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "You should not have come this far alone," he said. "Not with a child that young." She felt the familiar stiffness move through her. "I did not have a great many other options," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not criticizing you. I am saying what is true, which is different." She looked at him then. The firelight moved across the angles of his face, the line of his jaw, the steadiness of his eyes. "You say true things," she said, "even when they are inconvenient." "I find the inconvenient ones are usually the most necessary," he said. She looked back at the fire. "Tom was not always truthful," she said. It was the first time she had said anything critical of her husband to anyone, and she was mildly startled by her own willingness to say it to this man she had known for approximately one full day. "Was he a bad man?" Clarence asked. "No," she said immediately, and she meant it. "He was a good man who found the truth less interesting than the story he wished were true." "There is a difference." "There is," Clarence agreed. "He believed we would make it out here," she said. "He had that absolutely. The fever took him before he had to test it. And you are testing it for him." "I am testing it for us," she said, "for what we were going to be." The fire crackled. An owl called somewhere in the cottonwoods. The horses and the mule were quiet at their picket line. "That is a hard thing to carry," Clarence said. "Most things worth carrying are," she said. He nodded slowly, looking into the fire. She had the sense that he understood this in a way that was not abstract but personal, that there were things he carried with equal weight and equal silence. They said good night without any awkwardness about it. He rolled out his bedroll under the wagon, which was the practical decision in terms of weather, and also the appropriate one in terms of everything else, and she climbed into the wagon with William, and the night was quiet and warm enough and full of cricket song. She lay on her back and listened to the sound of the territory, and thought that she had not talked that freely to another person since January, not even to her sister-in-law in Abilene, and she was not sure what to do with that information. The second day on the road brought trouble of a different kind than river crossings. About mid-afternoon, two men on horses appeared coming from the east at a pace that was too purposeful and too fast for casual travel. They pulled up in front of the wagon in a way that required Clarence, who was riding 10 yards ahead, to wheel his horse around and come back. The men were rough-looking in the way that was not picturesque roughness, but the actual kind, unshaven and dirty, and carrying the particular watchful quality of men who were accustomed to calculating odds. One of them, the bigger of the two, looked at Anna and then at Clarence and then at the wagon with an inventory that made her grip the reins tighter. "Heading to Guthrie," the bigger man said. "We are," Clarence said. He had positioned his horse between the men and the wagon without making a performance of it. "We heard there is a widow woman traveling this road alone with a land deed for parcels near the Cimarron Fork," the bigger man said. His eyes were on Anna when he said it. "Is that right?" Clarence said. His voice had not changed in volume or pace, but it had changed in some quality she could not name, the way a river changes when it gets deep. "Could be worth something to the right buyer," the man said. A woman alone, no one to help her file. She might find it easier to sell. She might, Clarence said, but she will not. And who are you to say so? Clarence Hartwell, and you would be. The men looked at each other. Something passed between them. We are just passing through, the bigger man said, and his voice had lost some of its conviction. That is good to hear, Clarence said. We are also just passing through, and we would appreciate the road being clear. Another long moment. Anna did not move. She held the reins, and she looked at the men with the same expression she had used on the north bank of the Canadian River when she was calculating distance, and the men seemed to find this disconcerting. People with schemes tended to prefer that women be frightened rather than assessing. The two riders turned their horses and left at a canter, heading back the way they had come. Clarence watched them out of sight. Then he turned and looked at Anna, and for just a moment the steadiness of him showed a crack, something urgent and concerned that he immediately tidied away. They knew about your deed, he said. Someone in Abilene talked, or someone in Kingfisher. The surveyor Holt, she said. He nodded. Possible. We should move on and not camp where the road is visible tonight. She agreed. They made 6 more miles before finding a hollow sheltered by a low ridge and a dense stand of blackjack oak, invisible from the road, and made camp there with no fire, eating cold cornbread and dried beef and sharing a single canteen of water in the dark. William, oblivious to the drama, slept with his usual imperious serenity. Are they a real danger? She asked, keeping her voice low. The land around the Cimarron Fork is being watched by several interests, Clarence said, equally quietly. Men who file claims on behalf of Eastern investors. They identify lone claimants, apply pressure, buy them out cheap, or simply file competing claims and use the territorial courts to tie things up until the smaller party runs out of money. It is not legal exactly, but it is practiced. What do we do about it? He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking in the dark. We get to Guthrie faster than they expect us to, he said, and you file before any competing claim can be entered. Once the filing is recorded with the date, it becomes much harder to challenge. How far are we? At a good pace, we can make Guthrie by tomorrow evening. Then we travel at a good pace, she said. We do, he agreed. There was nothing complicated in his use of that word, we, and yet she felt it settle somewhere in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. They were on the road before sunrise. The gray had a longer stride than the mule, and Clarence reined him back to match her pace without comment. They covered ground steadily through the cool of the morning, the territory opening up around them into the long swells of the southern plains, the grass flattening in a way that gave you the sense you could see halfway to the horizon. Hawks turned slow circles in the updrafts above. In the middle distance, once, a small herd of bison moved like a brown tide across a low hill and then were gone. She told him about Ohio, about the town where she had grown up, about her father who had been a schoolteacher and her mother who had been a schoolteacher's wife with opinions that exceeded her station and energy that exceeded the outlet available to her, which was something Anna recognized. He told her about Tennessee, about the farm his family had worked, about younger siblings who had scattered after the war to various corners of the country, about a mother who had died when he was 12 and a father who had done his capable and loving best with a grief he never fully resolved. That is why I know how to hold babies, he said. I practically raised the youngest 3. What happened to your father? Passed a few years after the war. The farm could not be kept. My sisters are married now, one in Memphis, one in Texas. My brothers are somewhere. I get letters occasionally. Do you miss Tennessee? He considered this with the seriousness he brought to every question. I miss the idea of it, he said finally. The particular smell of the land after rain, the sounds, but the territory suits me better. It is new enough that a man can be whoever he is able to make himself. You are not just your past here, she said. Exactly, he said. And then, after a moment, I think that is also why you came. She had not thought of it in those terms before. She had thought of it as obligation, as honor to Tom's memory, as necessity. She had not thought of it as a choice to reinvent herself along with the land. The idea was unfamiliar and slightly frightening, and also thrilling in the way that genuinely new ideas tended to be. "Maybe," she said. William chose this moment to demand attention with considerable volume, and the philosophical conversation gave way to the practical one, and they stopped at a creek, and she fed the baby while Clarence rubbed down the mule and checked the wagon wheel that had been pulling slightly to the left since the river crossing. He adjusted the wheel nut with a wrench from her toolbox without being asked, and without announcing what he was doing. She watched him crouch in the dust next to the wheel with his sleeves pushed up, methodical and efficient, and thought about the fact that for 11 days she had managed everything herself, not because she was uniquely capable, though she was quite capable, but because there was no one to manage anything with her. The loneliness of that was something she had been pushing against the edges of without letting herself look at it directly. She looked at it now. She did not weep. She was not a woman who wept easily, and certainly not in public, even a public as small as one man and a baby at a creek in the Oklahoma Territory. But she felt the loneliness fully for a moment, the whole weight of it, and then felt it shift slightly, not disappear but shift, as if something had come alongside it. They made Guthrie in the late afternoon of the third day, riding into town on a wide road that was busy with the particular industry of a territorial capital that was still figuring out what it was. Guthrie in 1873 was a raw, determined place, buildings going up and coming down and going up again, land offices with lines of claimants stretching out the doors, horses and wagons and walking men in every variety of gear from buckskin to broadcloth. There was dust and noise, and the smell of new lumber and horse and ambition, and it was as different from the quiet homesteads she had passed along the road as possible. The Territorial Land Office was on the main street, a narrow building with a hand-painted sign. There was a line, but it was moving. Clarence took William and walked with him outside while Anna stood in line for 45 minutes with her oilskin pouch pressed to her chest. The clerk was a young man with ink on his fingers and the expression of someone who had processed a great many claims and found the process neither romantic nor particularly interesting. He took her deed, examined it, compared it against his ledger, checked a large territorial map on the wall with a brass pointer, and then stamped 3 separate documents and handed her 2 copies. "Certificate of filing recorded," he said. "Date and time noted. You will need to establish physical residence on the parcel within 60 days to secure the full claim." "I understand," she said. She walked out of the land office into the Guthrie afternoon sun with her copies pressed flat against her palm, and Clarence was standing at the hitching rail with William on his hip, and he looked at her face and knew. "Done," she said. He exhaled slowly, something releasing in him that told her he had been more worried than he showed. "No competing claims. None recorded. Good." He handed William back to her, and she settled the baby against her hip and looked at her filed certificate and felt the accomplishment of it move through her like warm water. "I need to file my own claim," he said. "Then go," she said. "We will be at a boarding house when you are done." He found them at the Grant Street boarding house, which was run by a stout and energetic woman named Mrs. Acaffer, who had come to the territory from Ohio 15 years earlier, and had been filing, building, and expanding her establishment ever since. She fed them an excellent supper of roast chicken and cornbread, and afterward Clarence sat on the boarding house porch with William while Anna washed her hair with the hot water Mrs. Acaffer had provided, and through the thin wall she could hear him talking to the baby in a low, steady voice, narrating the activity on the street outside in the way a person narrates to a child knowing full well the child understands nothing yet but tells them anyway. She stood with her wet hair and her hand on the wall and listened, and the crack in the armor opened another fraction. That evening, after William was down, she sat with Clarence on the porch in the warm Guthrie dark, and they talked for 3 hours. She did not know quite how 3 hours passed because it felt like nothing like that. It felt like a long and continuous thought that kept generating new branches, about the land and the territory, and how to work a claim with no hands but one's own, about cattle versus crops versus a combination of the two, about water rights and fence law and the slow grind of territorial politics. And then gradually, imperceptibly, it shifted into other things. He told her about a woman in Abilene he had been serious about 2 years before, a schoolteacher who had gone back east when her mother took ill and had not returned, and had written a letter that was kind and final. "Did you love her?" Anna asked. "I respected her," he said. "I liked her very much. I am not sure that is the same thing, though I told myself it was at the time." "What would the same thing look like to you?" she asked. It was a more intimate question than she had intended, and she felt it as she said it. He was quiet for a long time. The street was quiet too, the nighttime sounds of the territory coming in over the porch rail, crickets and a distant coyote, and the soft movement of horses. "Someone whose mind keeps surprising me," he said finally. "Someone who meets the hard things head on. Someone I want to hear talking for the rest of however long I get." He said it looking at the dark street and not at her, which allowed her to look at him. "That is a good answer," she said very quietly. He turned and looked at her then. The lamplight from the window was soft and warm, and his eyes in it were something she had no immediate words for. "Anna," he said, just her name, nothing else. But the way he said it, with a gravity and a warmth and a careful attention, was entirely sufficient. She looked at him for a long moment. "It has been 4 months," she said. Not as an excuse, but as a fact, and they both understood what it meant. That she was still close to Tom, still inside the weight of it, still not a person who could simply move cleanly forward. "I know," he said. "I am not asking for anything. I just want you to know that I see you. Not the widow, not the woman with the land claim. You." Her throat tightened. She looked back at the street. "That is terrifying," she said. "Yes," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. "It is for me too." They said good night. She lay awake for a long time. In the morning, they made practical decisions. She needed to get to her land parcel within 60 days to establish residence, and the parcel was approximately 30 miles south of Guthrie. He needed to begin the same process on his grazing land 12 miles further north of her parcel, which meant their routes separated beyond a certain point. They had a week, perhaps, of overlapping practical need. She did not want to think too closely about what happened after the week was up. They spent 2 days in Guthrie gathering supplies, arranging the purchase of a small quantity of seed corn, and potatoes from a merchant who sold at territorial prices which were high enough to hurt, having the wagon wheel properly repaired by a blacksmith who was honest about what he was doing and charged accordingly. Clarence replaced his boots and bought a second coil of rope and 2 additional sacks of feed for his horse. He also, at a general store she did not know he had visited, bought a small tin of the hard penny candy that was William's particular joy, which she had mentioned once in passing while talking about something else entirely. He left it on the wagon seat with no note. She knew anyway. She picked up the tin and held it and made herself breathe before going to find him at the stable. "You did not have to do that," she said. "The boy needs some joy in his diet," he said. He was brushing the gray, not looking at her. "Clarence," she said. He stopped brushing and looked at her. "I am frightened," she said. It cost her something to say it, and they both knew it. "Of what?" he asked, not dismissively but genuinely. "Of needing something again," she said. "Of building something again and having it taken." He set down the brush. He turned to face her fully. "I cannot promise you that nothing bad will happen," he said. "I cannot promise you the land will prosper or that we will both be healthy or that the territory will be kind. Those things would be lies. What can you promise?" She asked because she needed to hear what the honest answer was. He was quiet for a moment. "I can promise that what I am feeling is not convenient or accidental," he said. "That I have not wanted to stop talking to a person this much since I was young enough to believe the world was simple, and that if you asked me to ride on and leave you to your claim, I would do it because you have the right to ask that, but I would not want to." She looked at him for a long time. "I am not asking you to ride on," she said. Something moved across his face that was not quite the almost smile she was used to, but was its full and unconcealed version, and it changed his whole face, and she felt it in her sternum like a bell struck. They left Guthrie on the following morning heading south, and this time there was no pretense about two separate travelers who happened to be going the same direction. The road south wound through country that was getting progressively more beautiful as they moved away from the raw commerce of the capital, the land rolling into long, gentle swells green with spring grass, the sky enormous and luminous overhead. They passed a Pawnee encampment a mile off the road, the conical shapes of the lodges visible in the distance, horses moving in a corral of woven rope. Clarence raised his hand in the direction of the camp with the respect a man showed for people on their own land, which was a respect he had clearly developed through time and consideration rather than convention. "The Pawnee have been pushed from most of their traditional range," she said. "They have," he said, "and the territory is filling with settlers every season. It will be less and less theirs." He said it with a flatness that was not indifference but the particular grim weight of a man who knows a thing is wrong and has insufficient power to stop it, but refuses to pretend it is right. She had not expected him to say that. She had expected the standard frontier pragmatism, the manifest destiny language that most men she had known used as both explanation and justification. His refusal to use it made her look at him differently again, added a new dimension to the picture she was building of who he was. "My father used to say that a country reveals its character by how it treats the people it has power over," she said. "Your father was right," he said. "And this country does not always reveal a flattering character in that regard." They talked about it as they rode, the complexity of being on land that had been someone else's, the impossibility of ignoring that while simultaneously surviving in the only way available to them, which was to use the land. It was not a comfortable conversation, and neither of them tried to make it comfortable, and she found his willingness to sit with the discomfort of it without resolving it falsely to be one of the things she admired most about him. They reached the boundary of her parcel on a Tuesday afternoon in the golden green light of a late spring day. It was marked by a surveyor's stake half buried in the grass that she found by triangulating from the landmarks described on the deed. She stood next to the stake with William on her hip and looked across the land that was legally hers, 160 acres of river-bottom grass with a line of cottonwood and willow marking a creek that ran along the northern edge. It was beautiful. It was also empty in every direction. There was a structure, she said, remembering what Clarence had told her. "The family that tried it before. Down near the creek," he said, "there will be something left." There was. A cabin of sorts, roofless where the sod had collapsed but the walls of mortared stone still standing, a root cellar with a sound door, a hand-dug well with a rope and bucket still in place that Clarence tested and pronounced good. The creek was clear and cold, running well from the spring melt. She stood in the roofless cabin and looked up at the sky through the absent roof, and thought that this was genuinely worse than she had imagined and also absolutely workable, and both of those things were simultaneously true. "I can help you get a roof on before I need to get to my land," Clarence said. He was measuring the wall tops with his eye, calculating, already building it in his head. "You do not have to," she said. "I know I do not have to," he said patiently. "But the 60-day residence requirement is going to be a problem if you cannot keep rain off the child, and I can pull roof timbers and sod in about 3 days if we work from first light." "We," she said. He looked at her, the full smile again, not frequent enough to be cheap. "We," he said. They worked from first light for 3 days. He cut poles from the cottonwood stand and she stripped and prepared them. He worked the heavy lifting. She mixed the sod mortar. She cooked between tasks and he tended William between tasks, and the baby, as if understanding the purpose of the industry, was cooperative and sunny-tempered in a way he was not always. By the end of the 3rd day the cabin had a serviceable roof of pole and sod and cedar bark that would keep rain out and was considerably better than nothing. She stood back and looked at it with her hands on her hips and felt something she recognized as pride. "It is not pretty," she said. "It is solid," he said. Pretty can come later. He was standing beside her with his shirt sleeves rolled up and sawdust on his face, and she turned and looked at him, and thought that she was done arguing with herself about what she felt. She did not say it yet. There was a right time for things, and she knew that a woman who had been widowed for 4 months and was standing in the mud outside a barely habitable cabin on a claim she had not yet proved, did not simply announce her heart's condition and expect the world to accommodate it. But she held it inside herself and let it be real, and that was its own thing. On the 4th morning, he said he needed to ride north to his land. The grazing claim required his physical presence and attention, and he had already delayed more than he should have. She had known this was coming. They stood by his horse at the picket line with William between them, sitting on a blanket in the new grass and attempting to eat a handful of clover with focused determination. "It is 12 miles, he said. "I know where your land is," she said. "I will ride down in a week to see how you are getting on. You do not need to do that." "Anna," he said, with a patience that was also clearly something else. "I know," she said. "I know you want to, I just—" She stopped. He waited. "I have been alone for 4 months," she said. "I learned how to be alone, and now I have to learn it again, and I am not sure I want to." He stepped closer. Not close enough to be inappropriate, but close enough. He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had done that, and he held it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete and unhurried and sure. "You are not learning to be alone again," he said. 12 miles is not alone. 12 miles is Sunday afternoons and Wednesday mornings and any emergency between. 12 miles is something we can both work with." She looked at their hands. His were larger than hers, rougher, already marked by the work of the last few days. "You are very certain of things," she said. "Not usually," he said. "About this I am." She squeezed his hand once and let go, because William had gotten the clover into his mouth and needed to be immediately stopped. Clarence laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, not the wry almost smile, but an actual laugh. And it was warm and surprised and entirely genuine, and it made her laugh too. And they were both laughing over her baby trying to eat a fistful of clover on the prairie, and it was one of the best moments she had had in longer than she could accurately calculate. He rode north that morning. She stood with William on her hip and watched him go across the green grass, his gray horse moving at an easy canter, and she did not try to be stoic about it. She just felt what she felt and decided that was sufficient. The weeks that followed were the hardest and most satisfying of her life. She established her routine on the land with the same methodical focus she brought to everything. She planted the kitchen garden in the rich river-bottom soil and irrigated it from the creek with a buckatan ditch system she designed herself and built over 3 days of exhausting work. She traded labor with a Chickasaw family who had settled 3 miles east, helping them with their washing in exchange for their help with the heavier turning of her field. The family had 2 young daughters who adored William and whom William adored in return, and this arrangement was its own kind of good. She repaired the root cellar door with hardware she had carried from Guthrie. She built a proper sleeping shelf inside the cabin and made a pallet for William from stuffed burlap. She established a relationship with the nearest trading post, 10 miles east, and learned which of the other settlers in the area were honest and which required watching. And Clarence came on Wednesday mornings. He came reliably, which was the thing she had not known whether to trust. He came on his gray horse with useful things in his saddlebags, a tool he had acquired, seed she had mentioned needing, once a bushel of dried corn from a neighboring settler he had traded fence work with. He worked beside her for the day without making it a gift, making it instead a natural continuation of what they had begun at the river, 2 people who were more useful together than apart. He stayed for supper and sometimes into the evening, and they sat on the cabin step in the long summer dusk and talked, and sometimes said nothing, both of which were equally easy. He told her about his grazing land, the way the Cimarron grass was coming in heavy this year, about the small herd of longhorns he was arranging to purchase from a Texas drover who was moving north on the trail. She told him about the Chickasaw family and their knowledge of the land, about things she was learning from them about reading weather from the prairie sky, about plants that were useful and ones that were harmful. She watched him listen to her. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention, not waiting for a pause to insert his own thoughts but genuinely tracking what she was saying, building on it, asking questions that showed he had heard not just the words but the meaning beneath them. She fell in love with him the way the spring grass came in, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but steadily, green coming up through the frost-pale soil, pervasive and deep-rooted and entirely alive. In July, on a Wednesday evening when the sun had gone down and left the sky in bands of copper and violet, and the first stars were beginning to appear, he said it first. "I am in love with you," he said. He said it looking at the sky because he was a man who did not always find the direct statement easiest, and she appreciated that. "I wanted you to know it plainly and without embellishment. That is simply what is true." She turned to look at him. "I know," she said. And then, because it had been true for a while now and she was done pretending otherwise, "I am in love with you as well." He turned and looked at her. Whatever he saw in her face confirmed what she was saying, and he exhaled slowly. And she watched the set of his shoulders change in a way she had never quite seen before, something releasing that she realized he had been holding for a long time. "I did not want to push you," he said. "I know," she said again. "How long?" he asked. "Since the river," she said honestly, not in a way I had words for, but since then. He was quiet for a moment and she could feel him holding that, understanding it. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked, which was such a characteristic thing for him to say that she almost smiled. "I want to do it properly," she said. "Not rushed, not desperate, but properly, with time and care and the intention of it being permanent." "That is exactly what I want," he said. He reached over and took her hand again, and this time he did not let go for a long while, and they sat in the copper and violet dusk of the Oklahoma Territory with William asleep inside the cabin, and the crickets started up and the stars came out fully overhead, and everything felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it was headed in the direction it was supposed to go. He asked her to marry him in September, when the harvest was in and the days had shortened, and the light had turned from summer gold to the deeper amber of autumn. He did not have a ring, which he apologized for with a seriousness that she found both endearing and unnecessary. "I will get one," he said. "You do not need to," she said. "I want to," he said. "You deserve to have things done properly." He had asked her on a Sunday afternoon when he had ridden down after 3 days of fence work on his property, and the weather had broken clear and warm after a week of rain, and they were sitting on a blanket in the grass near the creek with William, who was having a strong opinion about a grasshopper he had found and was conveying this opinion to the surrounding landscape. "Anna Rhodes," he said, with the gravity that he applied to all important statements, "I would like to marry you. I would like to help you work this land and raise William, and whatever other children come to us if God is willing. I would like to be the person you talk to every day for the rest of our lives. I cannot make any promise that guarantees things will be easy, but I can promise that whatever comes, I will face it next to you." She looked at him and felt the full weight of it. The loss of Tom, the months of carrying everything alone, the river crossing, the road, the 3 days building the roof, the Wednesday mornings and the Sunday afternoons and all the conversations in between. "Yes," she said, simply and completely. He kissed her for the first time, there on the blanket by the Oklahoma Creek with her baby chasing a grasshopper in the autumn grass, and it was warm and careful and completely right, and she put her hand against his face and felt him lean into it and thought, there it is. This is what was supposed to be at the end of all of it. They married in October of 1873 in Guthrie, in the small Methodist church that had been established there in the spring. The preacher was a young man from Indiana who was sincere and thorough and took his time. Mrs. Akafar attended because Anna sent her a letter, and she arrived 3 days before the wedding with a trunk full of food that she proceeded to cook for the event with absolute authority. The Chickasaw family came, the husband and wife and their daughters, who wore their best clothes and brought a gift of woven grass baskets that were the most beautiful things Anna had owned since Ohio. A handful of neighboring settlers came, people Anna had traded work with over the summer, and 2 of the men Clarence had worked fence with on the Cimarron grass. Anna wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that was not a wedding dress but was the best she had, and Clara Finch of the Kingfisher boarding house, who had also been invited and also arrived, had let out the seams of it and added a collar of white cotton that made it look both improved and intentional. In her hair, she wore a single wild aster that one of the Chickasaw girls had brought her that morning from the creek bank. Clarence wore his good coat, which was charcoal gray broadcloth, and his best hat, and he had shaved with a precision that suggested he had taken considerably longer than usual. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with William on her hip, because there was no one to hold the baby, and the sight of her apparently affected him more than he was strictly prepared for, because he looked at her the whole way with an expression that he made no effort to conceal. She handed William to Mrs. Akafar at the front and stood before the preacher and took Clarence Hartwell's hands, which she had held before but not like this, and they made their promises to each other in the warm October light of the Methodist Church in Guthrie, Oklahoma Territory, and each word felt like something being built rather than simply said. He had gotten the ring. It was a simple band of yellow gold, not elaborate but solid and true, and he placed it on her finger with a steadiness that did not waver. "There," he said quietly just for her, and she understood all the things he meant by that one word. After the wedding they returned to her land because it was the larger operation with the more pressing needs, and because it was where William's life was established, and Clarence moved his essential operations south and managed his grazing land with periodic trips north. Within a year, he had arranged with a neighboring settler on the Cimarron to watch over the longhorn herd in exchange for a portion of the calves, which freed him from the daily requirement of being 12 miles away. The second winter in the territory was harder than the first had been for Anna alone, but infinitely better because she was not alone. Winters on the southern plains were unpredictable and occasionally savage, and the blizzard that came in February of 1874 was the kind of thing that would be talked about for decades afterward. 3 days of horizontal snow and wind that drove the cold through every chink in the cabin walls and kept them inside by the fire with William between them, reading by lamplight from the 2 books she had brought from Ohio, one a collection of poetry that had been her father's, and one a practical guide to farming that she had bought in Abilene. Clarence read the poetry aloud in the evenings. She would not have predicted this about him, and yet it was entirely in keeping with everything she knew of him, the careful attention, the respect for precise and honest language. He had a good voice for it, low and unhurried, and William fell asleep to Tennyson, and she knitted a wool hat and the wind howled outside the stone walls, and the fire was warm and she realized one night with a quality of surprise that was also recognition, happy. Not the uncomplicated happiness of before Tom died, before the grief and the fear and the hard road. A happiness that had been built on the far side of those things and carried their knowledge in it, a happiness that understood its own fragility and chose to exist anyway. Spring came again. The garden was planted with greater confidence this year, expanded, more ambitious. A second field was turned and put to corn. Clarence, with a timber man from a settlement 10 miles east, began construction of a proper house on the foundation of the old stone cabin, a frame house with 2 rooms and a covered porch that faced east to catch the morning light, which was Anna's particular requirement. William began walking in June, with the explosive enthusiasm of a child who had been waiting approximately forever to locomote independently. And the Oklahoma Territory gave him every opportunity to practice this skill in every direction. He was a sociable, vigorous, endlessly curious boy, with Tom's light coloring and Anna's direct dark eyes, and, increasingly, Clarence's steadiness, which Anna thought might be the most useful thing anyone could give a child. She told Clarence one evening in July that they were going to have a child together. He was at the fence they were building on the south edge of the property, setting posts, and he stopped with a post hole digger in his hand and looked at her, and she watched everything she had told him happen in his face in the space of about 3 seconds, surprise and joy and wonder, and then something deeper, something she could see him bring to the level of a promise. He set down the post hole digger. He crossed the space between them and took her face in both his rough hands and kissed her forehead and then held her, and she felt his heartbeat against her cheek, fast with something that was clearly not composure. "All right," he said against her hair. "All right. You are pleased," she said. "I cannot find a word large enough for what I am," he said. The baby was born in March of 1875, on a night of tremendous weather that seemed entirely appropriate for Clarence Hartwell's child, a boy they named James Thomas, James for Clarence's father and Thomas for Tom Rhodes, because she had loved Tom and James had been his son's father, and the land they were working had been his dream first. And it mattered to her that the names of the dead were carried forward in the names of the living. Clarence held his son for the first time with an expression that completely demolished whatever remained of his natural restraint, and she lay exhausted and luminous in the bed watching him hold the newborn against his chest with that same steady care he had held William above a flooded river, and she thought that the sight of a good man holding a baby was one of the most beautiful things in the world. William, at 2 years old, found James Thomas initially puzzling, and then, as the weeks went on, increasingly interesting, approaching his new brother with the careful scientific curiosity of a very small naturalist examining a previously unknown species. He was gentle with the baby with a gentleness nobody had specifically taught him, which was perhaps the best early evidence of what kind of a person he was going to be. They were a family. The land proved itself in the second full year of working it, yielded its richness in the river-bottom soil that grew corn higher than a man's head and vegetables that needed no coaxing and grass that fed a small herd of their own cattle. 6 longhorns Clarence had bought in the fall of 1874, that grazed on the spring growth with a satisfaction that Clarence said was visible if you knew how to look at a cow. She learned how to look at a cow. She also learned about range conditions and dry summers and the timing of markets, and in the evenings after the boys were down she and Clarence talked about the operation, the way partners talked about something they had built together, with equal investment and equal authority. She filed her occupancy certificate in June of 1874, which secured the claim fully and irrevocably, and she rode to Guthrie to do it with Clarence beside her and both boys in the wagon, James Thomas in his basket and William on the seat between them, pointing at everything on the road with proprietorial excitement. In the land office, the same clerk with the ink-stained fingers stamped her final certificate and noted the date in his ledger, and she took the paper and walked out into the Guthrie sun and held it up and looked at it. "Tom," she said quietly to the sky, to whatever version of him was available to hear, "we did it." Clarence stood beside her and did not say anything because he understood that this moment had other presences in it besides his own, and his understanding of that was one of the many specific ways he loved her well. She lowered the paper. She looked at the sky for one more moment. Then she looked at her husband. "All right," she said. "Now we go home." Home was the frame house with the covered east-facing porch, the stone-walled root cellar full of the previous fall's harvest, the kitchen garden with its herb border that she had added this year along the stone path to the well, the creek that ran along the cottonwood trees at the north edge, the fields of corn coming up in their rows with the promise that all growing things carry in the first weeks of a season. Home was William running across the grass toward the cattle pen with his arms out, narrating his own activity in the detailed ongoing monologue of a 2-year-old who found the world inexhaustibly interesting. Home was James Thomas asleep in the shade of the porch in the basket she had woven herself from creek willow over the winter evenings. Home was Clarence coming in from the field in the late afternoon with his hat pushed back, and his face settled in the expression he wore at the end of a day's work, satisfied and present, and stopping to pick up William and carry him on his shoulders through the gate. And the sight of that, the ease and affection of it, never stopped striking her in a place that she was glad she no longer armored. She stood on the porch in the late afternoon light and watched them come across the grass, her husband and her sons, and she felt the full weight of everything it had taken to get here and did not flinch from any of it. Not the grief, and not the fear, and not the months of being alone, and not the river crossing, and not the hard winters, because all of it was part of the shape of this, and the shape was good. In the years that followed, the land did what good land does when worked with knowledge and care. The herd grew from 6 longhorns to 30, and then to 60, and they hired a young hand from the settlement east named Diego, who had come north from Texas looking for work, and who was skilled with cattle and horses in the way of someone who had grown up with both, and who fit into the operation with a willingness and competence that earned Clarence's respect and Anna's genuine liking within the first month. Diego stayed. He built himself a small bunkhouse at the south edge of the property and became as much a part of the place as the cottonwood trees along the creek. And in the way of ranch life, he was present at the table for most of the significant meals and absorbed into the rhythm of the household with a naturalness that made the boys regard him as somewhere between an uncle and an older brother. The house expanded. In the fall of 1876, Clarence added a 3rd room and a proper kitchen with a cast-iron stove ordered from a merchant in Guthrie, which arrived on a freight wagon in 3 pieces and required 4 hours and an amount of creative problem-solving to install that she would tell the story of for decades. The stove was magnificent. She baked bread in it that was the best bread she had ever made, and she told Clarence this, and he said the stove was an excellent investment, and she threw a dish towel at him, and he caught it and folded it and hung it back on the hook, which somehow perfectly characterized the architecture of their daily life together. Anna gave birth to their daughter in the winter of 1877, on a night of cold, clear stars that Clarence said felt like the whole sky was paying attention. She was born quickly and with considerably less drama than the weather of James Thomas's birth, which seemed to fit her character from the first day. They named her Margaret, after Clarence's mother, and she came into the world with her father's dark eyes and his capacity for stillness, which was a striking quality in an infant, and would prove to be an enduring quality in the woman she would grow into. The territory was changing around them. More settlers every season, towns growing, telegraph lines going in along the main roads, talk of eventual statehood that would not come for years yet, but that could be felt in the increased structure and formality of territorial governance. The injustices that came with the settlement were also becoming more visible in ways that were uncomfortable to witness. The continued displacement of the Pawnee, and the pressure on the Chickasaw and Choctaw lands that had been formally reserved, but were increasingly contested as more and more people arrived with claims that competed. Clarence spoke plainly about this in the way he spoke plainly about everything he believed. At the meeting of area ranchers and settlers that gathered periodically at the Kingfisher Town Hall to address territorial issues, he said clearly that the treaty rights of the Indian nations needed to be respected, and that men who violated those rights should be held accountable by whatever law existed to hold them. This was not a universally popular position, and he expressed it without apology. She admired him for it with a directness equal to her admiration for everything else about him, and told him so. "You know that not everyone in this room agrees with you," she said, after one such meeting, riding home in the wagon through the autumn evening. "I know," he said. "Does that concern you?" "It concerns me that the thing I am saying is true and is being ignored," he said. "Whether people agree with me personally concerns me less." "You are a stubborn man," she said. "You knew that at the river," he said. "I did," she agreed. "It was one of the first things I noticed." He glanced at her. "Was it an appealing quality?" "Extremely," she said. The smile, the full one, she had seen it 1,000 times by now, and it still did exactly what it had always done. William grew into a boy of extraordinary energy and sociability, with a gift for making friends across the considerable diversity of the territory's population, with the Chickasaw children, with the sons of the German and Czech settlers who were arriving in increasing numbers, with Diego's cousins when they came to visit from Texas. He was going to be a man who moved through the world with easy warmth. She could see it already, and it made her think of Tom in the best way, the enthusiasm and the openness without the difficulty with truth, because William had Clarence's straightforwardness working in him too. James Thomas was different, more reserved, intensely observant, the kind of child who stood at the edge of a situation and took everything in before engaging. He loved the cattle work with a focus that pleased Clarence enormously, and spent long hours alongside Diego learning the details of it with a patience well beyond his years. He was going to be a rancher in his bones. It was already clear. Margaret, who was learning to walk in the spring of 1878 with a focused determination that was entirely characteristic, showed early signs of being the most opinionated of the three, which, given the available genetic material, was saying something. Clarence handled this with such gentle amusement that Anna sometimes had to look away to keep from laughing. One evening in the summer of 1878, 5 years after she had arrived at the south bank of the Canadian River with a baby and a mule and $17, Anna sat on the east-facing porch in the long evening light and watched Clarence come up from the creek with James Thomas on his shoulders and William running ahead, and the baby on her blanket at Anna's feet tearing up grass with focused satisfaction. She had been thinking about the day at the river. She thought about it sometimes, not with the weight she used to, not with the fear and the grief tangled in it, but with a kind of grateful astonishment at the distance between that day and this one. She had been calculating the odds, sitting on that buckboard with the brown water churning below. She had been calculating whether to cross, whether to stay, whether any of it was going to come to anything. She had been so careful and so afraid and so armored, and then a man on a gray horse had come along the bank and waded into the cold river without complaint, and held her baby above the flood with one arm while she held the reins. She had watched him do that, and something had opened. She knew it now in a way she had not known it then. Clarence set James Thomas down at the gate, and the boy ran for Diego's bunkhouse to report whatever they had found at the creek, the essential business of 5-year-olds being to immediately share discoveries. Clarence came up the path toward the porch and looked at her and saw something in her expression. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "The river," she said. He sat down in the chair next to her. He reached over and took her hand, which he still did with the same quiet deliberateness as that first time, as if it were worth doing carefully every time. "What about it?" he asked. "I was so frightened," she said. "I did not show it, but I was." "I know," he said. "You were frightened of the river and you did it anyway. That is the definition of courage." "I was frightened of more than the river," she said. "I know that too," he said. "When you took William," she said, "and you went into that water, I watched you. I could not stop watching you, and something happened." She paused. "I did not have words for it then. I think it was the first time in 4 months that I had let myself feel anything that was not grief or determination." He was quiet, listening. "You held him so steady," she said. "In that current, with the water up to your chest, your arm never moved. He was completely safe. And I thought, whoever this man is, he is someone who will hold things steady, even in the middle of a flood." "Anna," he said softly. "I am just telling you the truth," she said, "since you prefer the true things." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, slow and deliberate, and held them there for a moment. "I knew at the river too," he said. "Not the same way, not with that understanding yet. But I saw you on that wagon with that mule and that baby and that look on your face, and I knew I was not going to ride past." "You said it was the sensible thing to do," she said. "It was," he said, "but it was also not purely sensible." He paused. "I had ridden past 3 people that week without stopping. You were the one I did not ride past." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the evening grass. "The way you looked at the river," he said finally. "You were calculating it, not afraid of it, calculating it. And that mule was planted in the mud, and you were sitting there with a baby, and you were going to cross that river if you had to get out and drag the mule yourself. I could see it." He paused. "I thought, that is a woman I want to know." She leaned over and put her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the east-facing porch in the Oklahoma evening and watched the light change across the grass and listened to the sounds of their children and their land. The years settled into a rhythm that had its own beauty. There were good years and hard years. A drought in 1880 that took a portion of the corn crop and required the difficult decision to sell half the herd before the pasture gave out entirely. A decision Clarence made with the clear-eyed pragmatism she had come to depend on. There was the death of Diego's horse, which was grieved by all the children and by Diego himself with equal sincerity, and the subsequent acquisition of a young roan that Diego trained with such patience and skill that it became one of the finest working horses in the county. There was the year William broke his arm falling from the fence and healed so fast and so completely that the doctor in Kingfisher said it was a waste of a good fracture, which William repeated to everyone he knew for approximately 6 months. There was the winter James Thomas decided he was going to learn to read at the same pace he learned everything else, which was to say intensively and completely. And by spring, he had worked through every book in the house and written a letter to the Guthrie Library requesting more, which the librarian answered with a parcel of 4 books, and a note that said she had never received a letter from a 7-year-old with such correct grammar. There were the long summer evenings on the porch and the cold winter evenings by the stove, and the conversations that never ran out, because he was still the person she most wanted to talk to, and she was still the person whose words he listened to with that complete attention, and they had not stopped surprising each other, which she thought was perhaps the best thing about a good marriage, that the other person remained genuinely interesting. Margaret, at 4 years old, declared with absolute authority that she intended to have a horse of her own, not a pony, a horse, and that it would be gray, because she had loved Clarence's gray gelding since she could focus her eyes. Clarence did not laugh at this declaration. He took it seriously, the way he took everything seriously, and said that when she was old enough to manage a horse she would have won, and he kept that promise with an exactness that was entirely characteristic when she was 7 years old, presenting her with a young gray mare named Silver that she proceeded to love with a single-minded dedication that made all 3 males in her family feel slightly redundant. Anna turned 36 in the fall of 1883. 10 years after the day she had sat on the north bank of the Canadian River and tried to calculate whether she was going to make it. She made a cake for herself because she liked cake and saw no reason to require someone else to make it. Clarence brought wildflowers from the creek bank, a large and somewhat chaotic bunch of asters and goldenrod, and one small spray of something purple that none of them could identify, and set them on the table without ceremony. The children made various offerings. William, now 12, gave her a carved wooden box he had made over the past 2 months in secret, working in the evenings in the barn with a knife and sandpaper he had traded fence work for. James Thomas, 10, gave her a letter he had written out in his best hand, which described in the careful observational language he brought to everything, the things he had noticed about her in the past year, the way she moved through the kitchen early in the morning, the sound of her voice when she was reading to Margaret, the particular expression she had when she was proud of something she would not say she was proud of. Anna read the letter and had to excuse herself briefly. Margaret, who was 6 and had opinions about every aspect of the occasion, had decided that the gift she was giving her mother was a performance, specifically a recitation of the first verse of the poem that Anna had been teaching her, delivered with such dramatic emphasis that it brought the house down. After supper, after the children were in bed, Clarence came to find her on the porch. He sat beside her and was quiet for a moment. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she said. Are you glad you crossed the river? He asked. She turned to look at him. He was 40 now, the gray beginning at his temples, the lines of the territory weather written into his face in ways that made him look more like himself rather than less. He was looking at her with those patient dark eyes that had been looking at her honestly for 10 years and had not changed the quality of their attention. I am glad I crossed the river, she said. I am glad you were on the other side of it. Other side of what? He said, and there was something in his voice that said he meant more than the Canadian River. All of it, she said. The grief, the fear, all the hard things I had to cross first. He took her hand. They sat in the October dark, under the Oklahoma stars that were as vast and brilliant as they had been on the first night she had camped on the road to Guthrie with a man she had known for 4 hours who had held her baby above floodwater without being asked. I love you, Anna Hartwell, he said. It was not the first 10,000 times he had said it, but it had the same weight every time, because he was a man who did not say things he did not mean, and the meaning had not diminished. I love you, Clarence Hartwell, she said. I have loved you since the river, and I will love you until I can no longer manage anything at all. He laughed, the warm, surprised laugh she had fallen in love with over a baby and a grasshopper in the autumn grass. She laughed too. Out across the grass, the cattle moved in the dark, and the creek ran steadily along its cottonwood bank, and the frame house with its east-facing porch sat solid and lit, and full of the specific warmth of lives being well lived. She looked out across the land that Tom Rhodes had dreamed, and she had made real. The land that Clarence Hartwell had helped her roof and plant and harvest and defend. The land where 3 children were sleeping with the deep assurance of children who have never in their living memory known a night that was not safe. She thought about the woman who had sat on a buckboard at a flooded river with $17 and a baby and a grief that was also a kind of armor. She thought about all the ways that woman had been insufficient for what she was facing, and all the ways she had been more than sufficient. She thought about the cracking open of the armor, how it had not left her undefended, but had left her open to something better than defense. She thought about a man wading into cold brown water with his arm raised and her child against his chest, steady as a fence post in a windstorm, stepping forward through the current without hurry or fear. She had watched him. She had held the reins and watched him. And everything that mattered had come from that watching. Come inside, she said. He stood and held out his hand, and she took it, and they went inside together, and the door closed behind them, and the light in the east-facing porch window burned warm and steady until well after midnight, because they were still talking, still surprising each other, still finding that the other person was the most interesting thing in any room. And out on the Oklahoma territory, the stars turned overhead in their ancient tracks, and the land lay quiet and whole and fully, irrevocably theirs.